about potential abilities, the genes only evolve because the trait itself gives them an advantage. But the possibility of these potentials, their future. So the genes changing right now to meet something in the future that it's completely unaware of is what doesn't make sense to Wallace, because the gene would be changing to meet a survival or meet something needed later on, but not at the moment. So furthermore, he goes on to talk about how organisms often evolve out of the necessity to forming specializations that promote optimal environmental survival. However, humans have evolved a brain that does not require further specialization to increase survival rates. A study conducted by Deborah S. Rogers and Paul R. Ehrlich, encompassing natural selection and cultural rates, initiated a two-way mantle test with the intent to decipher the amount of cultural pattern correlations of chance by comparing functional traits versus symbolic traits. Their findings supported evolutionary change through cultural interpretation by establishing theoretical base patterns that may be utilized to comprehend or foretell circumstances for other possible cultural changes. Their findings also suggested that evolutionary mechanisms may be identified and predicted and may potentially contribute towards patterns of change that may lead to resolution between relationships and cultural changes, as well as the variety of specialized forces that may behave systematically. However, these findings don't mean that cultural changes are a result of genetic evolution. On the contrary, the causal relationship propelling the differentiation of cultural change may actually be quite the opposite. So, in other words, it seems to say through this study that it's not the genes that are genetically causing the alterations. It's the culture itself that is changing the genes. So basically, the empirical answer to the question at hand right here is still yet to be understood. Wallace continues. He states that evolution has no way of foreseeing the future. He says, what is the purpose of a latent mathematical gene developing tools in advance long before they are needed? What gifts of music and literature serve to promote human survival? How is it that all these amazing latent abilities formed within the prehistoric brain, but were yet to be acknowledged until the previous 100,000 years or so? After digging into all of this study and everything that he learned and looked into, Wallace finally concluded that some higher intelligence must have directed the process by which the human nature was developed, and parted ways with Darwin. As for Darwin, he still maintained that even the emergence of the most esoteric mental traits could be accounted for the evolutionary prime force, natural selection. In theory, a modern biologist might argue in Darwin's defense that advanced human traits are simply the inflation of general intelligence that has emerged over the past 100 years, manifesting in the form of esoteric abilities. After all, the evolutionary growth of the brain over time could have enhanced specific regions that give rise to Ramachandra acknowledges in chapter 9 and 10. Furthermore, one could argue how the bases of intelligence have advocated evolutionary change through natural selection, resulting in societal improvements for which individuals benefit from, such as the ability to execute mathematics like calculus, the ability to play and write music, and abilities that have enabled the engineering of scientific tools that please our senses, such as television, iPads, cameras, cell phones, music players, and so on. However, this modern-day argument still doesn't explain the empirical question behind the savant syndrome, as well as various other talents and geniuses that have sprung up sporadically throughout the normal population. As noted in Chapter 9, the ability of one savant alone, configuring numbers in a way that most intelligent professors were yet to master, doesn't exactly jive with the idea that evolution through natural selection formulated the specialized genes to propagate such specific talents through the inflation of one's general intelligence. Even Ramachandran questions the concept of natural selection. If such specialized esoteric talents had emerged for the purpose of promoting survival through adaptation, wouldn't it seem more logical for such talents to be expressed among those of the fittest? And secondly, taking into consideration the forces behind natural selection that drive the selection evolutionary transformation of advantageous genotypes for future offspring, why aren't these esoteric talents expressed in more individuals instead of remaining minimal in number, continuously from generation to generation? What Ramachandran is questioning is that genes that are better suited for survival will continue to perpetuate from generation to generation, whereas genes that are less significant for survival, they sort of dissipate. And so what the question here is that these esoteric talents continue sporadically throughout history, and there's no change in it. It doesn't slow down. It doesn't speed up. They're just continuously and sporadic. So what he's saying is, what would be the purpose of something that is sporadic? Because in natural selection, it would either become more predominant or it would dissipate. I think that is the question that the question that has them puzzled, I guess you could say. So esoteric talents. In 2002, there was a study, not a study, Jason Paget had been attacked by a bear, leaving him with a severe concussion and a case of post-traumatic stress disorder. Upon recovery, Jason emerged as a mathematical genius who was able to develop the ability to intuitively visualize complex mathematical objects and the concepts behind physics. Another study in a Time magazine evaluated 8 children prodigies in hopes to find a correlation between the participants. Their levels of IQ differed from one another, and only half of the children had been diagnosed with autism. However, all of the prodigies had scored off the charts where measures of working memory were applied. The majority of the children placed in the 99th percentile, with a minimal placement in the 99th percentile. Working memory, which is what they discovered was what they scored off the charts with, is located in the prefrontal cortex, where it temporarily stores and manages information necessary to execute complex cognitive tasks associated with learning, reasoning, and comprehension. The prefrontal cortex. An article in the NCBI journal exploring the integration of diverse information in working memory within the frontal lobe discusses the role of working memory and the experimental results that demonstrate how the frontal lobe specializes in maintaining working memory representations that combine verbal and spatial information. These higher levels of cognition that require characteristics designed for flexible mental configuration may be attributed towards the level of integration that takes place within the prefrontal cortex, specifically in the working memory, where numerous various information is processed and stored. Considering that the 8 prodigies, or savants you could call them, from the previous article are all displayed extremely high levels of working memory compared to the average individual, as well as displaying higher cognitive abilities, it would seem to reason that such esoteric abilities would correlate with the functional level of the prefrontal cortex. In turn, damage to the frontal lobe may alter an individual's cognitive abilities. So basically what these articles are talking about is what the working memory in the prefrontal lobe actually does and how it correlates to the savants. One case where he wasn't born a savant, but due to an accident that damaged his prefrontal lobe, he developed abilities. And then there was the 8 prodigies that were just simply born that way. And they all had that something in common with the prefrontal lobe. So in conclusion, currently several theories honing in on the pseudosciences of neuropsychology continue attempting to understand the inner workings of the human mind. Until the vast complexities of the human brain can be unraveled, the answers will remain in the future. I found an interesting picture that shows the percentages drop in creativity from childhood through adulthood, showing a 5-year-old with a 98% creative genius, and all the way to adulthood at 2% of creative genius. So, this diagram that I was talking about talks about, of course, how the creative intelligence declines from childhood to adulthood. My question that I posed in my slides was, is it a coincidence or not?